I'm Chris Stutchko, co-host of the Ninth Grade Experience podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
It's the High Tech Podcast, and you are joined by me, one of the hosts. I'm trying to correct this that we'll joke about in the next episode, as I realize about it. Josh Swartz, I'm one of the hosts of the High Tech Podcast. If you didn't know that, you're either new or really not paying attention. Also, joined with my co-host, the great, the awesome, the networking ninja, William Illingworth. How you doing, Will?
What's up, dude? I'm doing good. I was about to say for a second, I was like, oh, I'm going to make a noise like a ninja. And then I was like, ninjas don't make noise. So
yeah, well, I thought you were going to do like the doo-doo-doo, you know, like kind of like air horn sound. And then you didn't do anything. You just kind of like made movement. You know?
5-yard penalty.
5-yard, yeah, whatever. Sports ball. Ha! Nailed it. Yeah, so High Tech Podcast. We are here. It's another week. As we jump in, if you didn't notice too, and you're not watching video, Will was doing motions. That's why we're making fun of him, and then he didn't make any sound, which is another reason you should check us out on YouTube and watch video so you can see Will and I do cool things like this. You don't know what I'm doing, do you? Because you're now watching video.
But it was the coolest thing you've ever seen.
It'll change your life. Probably, maybe, sort of. I don't know. Most likely not. But we are here for another week of the High Tech Podcast as we jump into some things. This is an interesting episode for us. Will and I have been doing a lot of guests, guys. If you've been noticing, there's been a lot of guests on the High Tech Podcast, which is fantastic. We've been meeting a lot of people. We've been talking to a lot of people. Most other people are more interesting than Will and I. So it's a good topic for the podcast.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you got just the two of us this week again. We're back. It's just the two of us. The way it started, you know, old school, old hat. I've never gotten used to that phrase. That's fine.
Just old.
That's what we are. Anyway, this week we are going to be talking about what is universal to learning. Now, let me make sure I clarify something. Not what is universal design for learning or universal learning. Will and I are still working on the title. As you're listening to this, we haven't actually titled the episode yet. So whatever that is,
we're just making it work, folks.
It's about universal learning. It's more about like, Will and I were talking about this. Will and I have done learning design and have worked in this field in different environments over our careers, right, Will? I think that is probably a healthy way to put that. And so we have been in different spectrums, right? So in any given day, Will has, been in higher ed. He's been in smaller institutions, bigger institutions. I was not in higher ed. I was in higher ed. I was just managing an LMS. I'm, helping develop courses. And we're still doing all of that while also Will's doing some more stuff in corporate. And we're somehow making things with cartoon characters now. Like, things are happening in our lives. But the advantage is we're getting to see learning in different environments, right? So like, we're getting to see it both in a higher ed environment. We're talking to a lot of K-12 people, so we're getting to experience their experiences in learning. And we're also seeing it now kind of in adulthood, corporate, kind of after college learning, right? In this kind of type of context. And what's interesting, I think, to us is when you see learning across those spectrums, I think you can kind of see some things that are universal to learning no matter where you're at in that spectrum, or no matter what you're doing, no matter what your topic is, no matter what your field of expertise is, or your subject matter, no matter what that is, there are universal things that encourage learning, that enhance learning, right? I think you'd agree, right? Well, we've talked about this as a topic, and you're nodding your head, but like, does that make sense? Like, are you seeing this in your environment as you're kind of moving around different places?
Yeah, and this is actually something I've wrestled with for a long time. Like, I literally was first introduced to education in informal education. I was a martial arts teacher, martial arts instructor. I was very young. But one of those things is like, when I was doing it, it wasn't like, oh, I'm a teacher. I didn't see it that way.
Yeah.
When I got further, older, B, further along in my career, did my master's degree, started teaching, higher education. Eventually, I've done like corporate education, workshops, training and development. Those the content is always different. The things that you need to do to be able to teach and to learn, very similar. And I've got story after story after story just from the martial arts instruction that impact how I perceive
Yeah.
classroom instruction. And then you've got the corporate stuff, you've got the e-learning stuff, you've got the different levels of higher education I've been a part of, the K-12 support I've done. Like there's so much there that it is universal. Like one of those conversations I remember having back in the day with Dr. Justin Harbin, a friend of the podcast who's been on before. He'll be on again soon, actually. Was like, is andragogy really so distinct that we need to have it as a study separate from pedagogy?
Yeah.
Not familiar, listener. Pedagogy is from the Greek roots for child, and instruction, pedagogy, the instruction of children. Andragogy, then, in contrast, is andra, adult or human, and goji, again, instruction. So you've got this adult instruction or child instruction. There's some things that are significant for andragogy that are different from pedagogy, but I don't always feel that it needs to be distinct. All humans are motivated by the same things of hunger and attention and interest and motivation. All humans deal with that. Kids can be bribed with snacks. Adults can be bribed with snacks. Lunch and learn
meetings. Have you ever had lunch meetings? Adults get bribed with snacks just as much. As kids.
Adults write messages during class. Adults, slack off. Adults leave early. I was at a conference last week, right? And there were tons of adults in sessions the entire time, myself included, who were on devices doing other things, right? Like adults are just as quote unquote bad at learning as kids are.
Yeah.
When we oftentimes say like, oh, the adults will take care of themselves, we need to make sure that it's self-paced and in there. No. I don't settle with that. And that's an area where pedagogy to andragogy, we have a universal principle. Humans need to be engaged in their learning, regardless of age. That's a universal principle that I can see across contexts, ages, subject matters, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think probably like my view on this is that it's not necessarily that like there's different models. Like we're getting into a side conversation, but there's not necessarily different models for how that adults learn differently than younger people do in their context or children. It's more about like the way certain core elements of learning look for adults is going to be a little bit different. Like they may have some same motivations in many ways, but there's going to be some other things that maybe the way that plays itself out is going to look a little bit different, obviously, for an adult who has a family than it's going to look for a teenager learning. But the same concepts are still there, the same pieces are still there. That's where I would also still agree with you that I'm not sure there needs to be a clear break between those two groups, because it's not about that they learn differently. It's about it's about the core elements of learning look a bit different with that group than it does this group, because they are different people at different parts of their lives, but they're still the same core elements of learning, right? Like that's a difference. And somebody might be saying we're splitting hairs, and you're probably right. And guess what? I don't care. This is the point of what we're talking about, right? That there's a little bit of a difference. Now, I will say, I just want to get one point out real quick, because I've had an epiphany, which is that basically like happy hour events are like adult version of snack time. That's all I'm saying. Like, right? Like that's like it's just, as kids you get Pop-Tarts, as adults you get whiskey. Like it's not that different. That's all I'm saying. It's the
same motivator. It's just a different caliber and much more expensive.
And enough happy hour, and the adults will basically be like the kids who are eating Pop-Tarts.
Boom.
Like that's
done. The similarities are clear. No, and one of those things, like if we start to draw the comparisons, it's a good laugh, but I think that it's helpful to consider what is the same across learners, because the differences, the differences are not as distinct. Like, adult learners pay taxes. There's one motivator that is not involved in young learners. But like, do taxes really matter to learning? Sometimes. I'm not going to say they don't.
Yeah, I mean, if you're
But
learning to be an accountant, I feel like that's probably a big deal.
should be something
Just
you pay
saying.
attention to.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. But like you know what I mean? Like if when people try and split the hairs, right? Like, oh well, adults, they're taller. I, I, I don't care if they're taller.
Okay,
You
when I
know?
do a pinata, I'll make sure I rise it up higher in class if I'm doing it with adults. Okay,
But
Mike,
like
you got me.
if somebody comes out and they're like, well, adults are better at paying attention. I already started that case. I don't
Yeah,
think they are
100%
exclusively.
not true. That is
Right?
horribly incorrect. Adults are better at looking like they're paying attention, right? Like adults are better at socially understanding that they should be paying attention. They're
Right.
not better
About
at paying
faking it.
attention. Yeah, they're
Yes.
they're the and again, we're oversimplifying things, right? That it's well, it's a bit different. Yeah, I mean,
No, it's an
some,
expose.
right?
We're
Like
just trying to
younger
put light on it.
kids are obviously their attention, the way that you grab their attention and stuff like that, it's gonna be very different than adults, right? Obviously, content's different,
Right.
but the point we're getting at is that there's core design elements to learning that I think fit all groups, right? So like, Will, give me one, right? So obviously we've been bouncing around this topic a little bit. If somebody walked up to you and they were like, what's a core thing in learning that applies across all spectrums? Because that's a normal question somebody asks someone out of the blue. They just drop
Tuesday
in,
nights,
they ask you that question. Yeah, that's like on a regular Tuesday night on the podcast. What would be the first one you toss out?
It's actually kind of focusing on the negative side. Like, so there's the experience of emotions. All people experience emotions, but I've actually seen a consistency from adults to youth and from corporate to higher ed. Once a learner starts to experience a high, starts to hit their threshold. Let's put it that way. Starts to hit their threshold for a negative emotion. Let's say sadness. Let's say frustration. Let's say anger. They react the same way. They shut down. Adults do have a higher capacity for self-discipline and not acting out, maybe. I've seen kids throw temper tantrums, right, in my context. Yeah. Most adults. But like I've had this happen with a 50-year-old and a 5-year-old, right? Let's try to learn this task. So in the martial arts, it was a specific physical, like let's say punching, kicking, something like that. With an instructor, with a faculty member, was how to set up their grade book, right? So we're just talking tasks, very different contexts, but when the young learner met their threshold on frustration, they began to shut down. They no longer had the capacity for learning. It didn't matter how many times I tried to change it up, teach from a different angle, show it more than tell it, whatever, like it didn't matter. Once the kid hit the threshold of a negative emotion, done. I mean, literally, like, let's just move on. You're not going to get it this week. I've experienced that hundreds of times with young learners in martial arts. I've probably not experienced it as many times with adult learners, but again, when I'm sitting down with a faculty member, this is how your grade book works. And there's one or two kinds of capacity issues there. They just don't understand technology in the first place. Maybe there's just a general gap there on technology literacy, or it's not doing what they want it to do. In either case, once they hit the frustration level, again, we're done.
Yeah.
Why don't we try again tomorrow? Because they're just not going to be listening now. They're not going to be attentive. They're no longer interested. There's too much happening in the internal storm. They're not going to learn how to punch. They're not going to learn how to do the grade book. Doesn't matter the age. So that threshold for emotion, that experience the students have while learning, I've found to be consistent across the areas I've taught, across the ages I've taught.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree, right? Like emotions in general, how people feel and those dynamics, it's applicable to children, adults, out of high school, college, all the groups, right? Those emotions are going to impact the way that we learn, the way that people engage with things, how much they can take. It doesn't matter the grouping, right? And so like considering that of how somebody's going to feel coming to something or what this might do, it's not about over emotionalizing something or something like that. It's about realizing what is this going to do to your learner and how might that impact their ability to deal with what you're coming up with. Now that impact may look different for the different groups, but the concept is applicable across all age groups, all spectrums that you need to consider how this is going to make the learner feel, right? So like a good example of this might be let's go out of higher ed and let's go to this boot camp concept that people want to keep doing, like Code Academy and stuff like that, right? This is a place I hammer home into places. But the let's go back over to there, right? If you're gonna do a whole bunch of like monotonous tasks and things at the beginning at the learning, that's gonna make your learner feel bored. They're gonna feel unmotivated. They're gonna feel frustrated that they're doing the same things, and so that's gonna put at risk your learner succeeding in whatever course or system they're going through, because eventually that motivation might kill what they're doing, right? And so like this is kind of a combo of feelings and motivation, but at the same time that those things are going to make your learner feel a certain way, right? And that's going to put them into a bad state. If you give them way too complicated of things from the beginning, right, that's going to make them feel frustrated, and that frustration, once it gets to a breaking point, is going to get to the point that they're just going to stop and they're not going to want to do it. Most people will do that, and that's applicable to kids, adults, in between, dogs, whatever, right? Like the
not wrong.
Like, yeah, my cat, when she gets frustrated,
You
she'll
don't have
stop.
a cat.
Now she'll usually poop somewhere first, but then she'll stop.
Which is also not too unlike children, but
yeah. Anyway, another one I would throw out there: cognitive load theory, right? This concept of having to be conscious of how much you give someone at a time. That is going to be applicable no matter the age group, whether you're talking K-12, you're talking high school, you're talking college, and you're talking adults. And this applies even in the place I see this happening in higher ed, right? Is people have this like kind of, in my opinion, false assumption that like a grad student's cognitive load is higher than an undergraduate student's, right? Like that a younger student, their cognitive load, or that they haven't been as far in academia, their cognitive load is somehow different than a grad student. I highly disagree with this concept. It's more about that the grad student can understand maybe like more difficult topics, but the cognitive load's not about, in my opinion, just about difficult topics. It's about how much you throw at someone, right? So like that, it doesn't matter. It's not, a grad student doesn't somehow, they can handle 13 topics while an undergrad student can handle 5. It's not about a human being in general can only process so much information at a time. And so that principle of being careful not to overload someone with too much information is applicable at kindergarten. It's applicable at high school. It's applicable at higher ed. It's applicable in corporate world. For goodness sakes, I wish corporate world would really get this, because they don't. They want to jam a whole bunch of crap into a training. Like I'm just gonna get real for a second. Like we're doing adoption training right now in real life. Yeah. Right. And like, you think I'm gonna remember everything you put in these trainings? Like, it's like the one training's 10 hours long, and it's like like entire sections are just like throwing a bunch of information at you and then giving you a quiz. People don't learn that way. What they do is they copy and paste what you put in your slides somewhere else so that they can search it when they answer your questions.
Well, if they're Josh, they put it in Notion. That's what you're saying.
No, I didn't do that. I don't know what you're talking about. It's just the point being that like that load principle matters no matter what the heck you're designing. That's going to be important.
And that actually naturally rolls me into one that I think is also consistent, right? Regardless of the subject matter, 99% of the time, a tactile, quote unquote, a hands-on experience is going to be good for learners. I don't necessarily mean tactile. I started saying that. I was wrong. Hands-on, meaning engaged, participant.
Fidget spinner is what Will is talking about. I'm sure.
If you give them all fidget spinners, they will get hundreds on your tests. Yes, that is what I was saying. That's all it takes. Just give them a fidget spinner.
Out of this, there will be a philosophy class now that they're all just doing fidget spinners while they're talking about like Socrates. Sorry, continue.
I'd watch. No. Like Like there's not some universal truth here, but I see a consistent principle. Whether I had people working in faculty supporting them like in engineering, mathematics, martial arts, corporate learning, etc. Like where I see things going rough is like people are not actually involved, right? In corporate learning and like what you're experiencing, like
Oh
I
yeah.
bet you if you took a 10-hour workshop on this adoption stuff, a lot more of it would be retained. Would even be more interesting, like actually being in a place with people, working with like fake babies and stuff to like hold them, coddle
Oh yeah,
them,
absolutely.
do CPR on them, how to get out of a house in a fire, like whatever it is you've got. I don't. Holy crap! I don't know what you've got to be trained on as a
Oh, in the adoption
prospective
thing, yeah,
parent.
it's
Yeah. But like
it's mainly
that
that.
would actually have more value than what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to deliver 10 hours of workshop, and it's probably more expensive. But
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
educationally, it's more consistent. When I talk with some folks about how to start a podcast, I try to keep it more motivational, right? I've talked
Yeah.
to a handful of people over time, like, oh, how'd you do it? Well, and we've said it on the podcast before, we gave it a try. We got started.
Yeah.
We had to
Absolutely.
wrestle with our motivation. Like, if I try in that moment to teach them how to create a podcast, which requires a lot of technical skills, verbally, just like in a conversation, it's useless. If I want to
Yeah.
actually teach someone, the two things I have done is I made a recording for a friend who I knew had the technical skills to take my recording and do something with it. I made a recording of how I edit, the software I use, and I sent it off to him, and I could trust that if he really wants to follow through with it, he would watch the
Yeah.
recording and do it. Otherwise, we better darn well just sit there together and do it together. That is going to be something that will help someone learn that skill, and not just the skill of actually technically editing, but the why I choose to cut certain things, why I do an opening, why I do an outro, etc., right?
Yeah.
Um, I think that there are people who might react and be like, well, I don't think that's going to be as applicable to me. Sure. I remember my church history course where the faculty member did a lot of lecture, and I loved it. He was a great orator. I learned a lot. But he also had very engaging projects that got us into it. So there was time where we were just listening to him and not doing it. But he built that lecture towards the projects where we got our hands on the task. And we
Yeah.
studied church history over the millennia, over the centuries, as he was talking about it. Not literally at the same time in the class, but that was what worked. If you have people wrestling with these motivation things, some of the stuff Josh was leading into, I think the solution is more often than not hands-on learning, getting them into it, getting them engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably a good way to put what you're saying, and maybe this isn't the right way to say it, but like, is that like application is a principle that fits across all age groups and levels of what you're looking at. Because really, I think what you're getting at is like practical application of concepts. Now, a lot of times that'll be tactile. It'll be doing something. It'll be like in a podcast case, it's doing the podcast, right? You can't learn how to do a podcast by just somebody telling you're watching 10 hours doing a podcast. Okay, cool. You're a podcast expert. No, you have to do it. You have to apply that knowledge somewhere. I think bring it back, right? I remember having a conversation recently at two different levels, right? So there was a conversation with a designer at one point about being like, well, why are we applying in this 100 level course? They can't do that yet. And then there was the same conversation at the institution I was at about like level guidance for like 1 to 200 level courses in higher ed. And there were a lot of people going like, well, we got to cut all the application out because that's, according to Bloom's taxonomy, they can't do that yet. And this is why Will and I bash on Bloom's taxonomy sometimes, because it's abused. That's not the case. It doesn't matter what level you're at, what thing you're at. Application has to happen for someone to learn, in my opinion. And there are going to be people who strongly disagree with me, and that's fine. We can have an argument about it. We can work on it. We can apply the knowledge that we have, and then I'll be right. And then
email us at inbox@hightechpod.us if you want to come on and wrestle with this.
And wrestle with this. But in my opinion, application has to happen. Now, that doesn't look the same across all areas. Application for a third grader looks very different than application for a grad student, right? But that's also because the topics and things that you're doing are different. They're different understanding, but you still need to apply it at some level. And so what I get animated about this a little bit because it came up and it was kind of like there was a group that was almost like this was understood. It was like, oh yeah, you're right. Like 100, 200 level courses, we can't do application in them. What do you mean we can't do application? Are you just gonna have them memorize concepts and then at a 300 to 400 level course, they're going to apply it? That's the most boring course, first of all. And second of all, it means nothing. Like they haven't actually learned anything. Yeah,
it's so far disconnected from the application that you have a huge assumption that what they did 2 years ago academically in the 100 courses is going to make the connection to what they're now doing 2 years later in the 300 level courses.
We know in learning science that doesn't happen. Like that's not how it works. It breaks apart, and we wonder why our students aren't critically applying what we have in higher ed or in corporate or what, wherever you put it. We wonder why. It's because we're not asking them to take that knowledge and do anything with it. Right. And I'm not saying, sometimes you're limited, right? You're doing an hour session in corporate. Like you can only do so much, but I would argue that you should figure out how you can fit some kind of application in there, right? Because it's going to get into the motivation. It's going to help them understand why it works. And it's going to get their feet wet working with the concept they're doing. And I've heard the argument before of being like, well, I can't do that because I have so much I need to cover. Well, cover less. Because at the same point, it's not going to work. If you cover too much, it's not going to work. Is your goal communicating everything you think it needs communicated, or is your goal that they actually learn something when they leave that class or session or training? If it's when they learn or leave that session for training, pull back the amount of what you're doing and make sure they have a chance to apply something that you talked about in a real life scenario.
Listener, I'm back here just golf clapping. Just preach, brother. Get up there, preach.
That must have been built up for a while. I've been letting that out there for a hot second.
and there's something to that. Like, again, I said it. I think I said it next episode, ironically, but I'll say it again this episode before that happens. I don't know. I was just at a conference last week, and my feedback to much of the conference was a lot of this content's 101. And I meant that in like the worst possible way, right? Very elementary content. And not reaching far enough to pull us into the process. Like, I've been to a lot of conferences that were led by educators, and it can be annoying, but like the breakout rooms, quote unquote, or the activities in the conferences where you actually try to do what they suggested on screen. That's it. Hey, let me get up here and tell you for 15 minutes this really cool tool I've used, this really cool technique I've used, and then let's spend 45 minutes trying it out and wrestling with it ourselves. That is what I want in a conference. Going and sitting and just being talked at for an hour about something I'm actually not interested in and not going to use because the session title sucked and I don't feel like leaving. That's missing the mark with those 101, 101 approaches. Like, we need to get away from that. It's not about 101, 201, 301. It's like, what do we want them to be able to do? Yeah. The irony of that is that is education 101. That's the core principle when you come into education. Is like, what are your objectives? What do you want them to accomplish? That is where we should focus.
And bring it back real quick to, and this is opening a door that, like, and there's plenty of other principles, by the way. Will and I are not going to get to all of them in this episode. We're probably only going to get to a couple, just as my caveat. But, like, to get to a topic that I feel like pushes back on this application thing a bit more, not necessarily like the faculty in that area or the people teaching that, but like is difficult to think about, right? So go to a philosophy class for a hot second, right? A philosophy class is gonna be like, well, it's not welding. Like, I can't be like, here, go weld this, or it's not creating something in a learning management system. I can't be like, go create this, it's you're working in philosophy, right? So like an application might be, in my opinion, taking a second to stop just talking about the philosophers, but to back into the real, or fast forward into our time and go, okay, how do we see this principle of whatever naturalism, right? Like how do we see that today, right? Like how would that be applied to this situation that's happening right now in our country, right? Like in taking that back and actually asking the students to think in that perspective and apply it to something they're looking at right now. Because at the end of the day, my thought, I'm not a philosophy professor, so I'm making this up as I go, and I'm sure I'm not entirely correct, but my hope would be, as a philosophy professor, your goal would be that they're not just understanding the philosophies, but they're understanding how it changes the way that they can see their world today. And if that's the goal, then have them do that. Have them apply it, right? And that is application. That's why I think application's a good term for it, other than like I think why you weren't happy with like just like the doing something or kind of the physical component of it, because it's not always physical. Application isn't always doing something physical. It's not always building a chair from wood with your bare hands in a flannel shirt, right? It's not always that, right?
All hail the
it's in other areas, right? Like a good example of this too would be going back. I had a logic course a while back in my higher ed experience, and we would talk about logic, arguing, and things like that. But then the professor would actually have you have arguments, like in debates, and apply those principles, and then come out of that and reflect on how people did it, what techniques they used, how did this change things, how did this person pull in a fallacy, you know, like those things. Have the students apply what's kind of an ethereal knowledge to a thing you want them to do, and they're not going to do it perfectly. You know, we don't expect them to have the same type of argument that a grad student in logic philosophy is going to have. That would be absurd. But we are expecting them to apply it in some way, because they'll be better at it for doing it that way, as opposed to just listening to us talk about it. I think,
and to the point that we've made kind of throughout here about the grad student comparison to the lower level students, you don't get to be good at it as a grad student without having practiced it at some point. Like the idea of the fact that, oh, they're too young to learn that, or they're not ready to learn that, false, fallacy, not true. Everyone is ready to learn something when they are motivated and present. Then they're ready to learn something. The quality of their product will be different depending on how long they've been doing it. I had a humbling moment this very morning. I am a martial arts practitioner. I've been doing it for 20 something years now, 22, 20, a long time, most of my life. Buddy. I got on a web class with my master instructor this morning, and he's like, what do you want to practice? I was like, let me do stuff for my current rank. And I got in front of him. He's like, all right, begin. And I was like, I don't remember it. Like, I like messed up some moves. I missed stuff in the middle. I was like, holy smokes. What was hard for me in that moment was, I'm a 20-year practitioner. I'm good at this. And then I go and do this thing that's for my current rank, which I haven't done 10,000 times. I haven't been doing stuff for my current rank for 20 years, and I couldn't do it. And I was like, oh, this is beautiful. Now I want to be better. Now I need to practice more. Now, like, I was like, it motivated me because I know what it's like to do a pattern, a form, a technique that I've been doing for 20 years. I know how good I am at doing it. When you start to do something for the first time, you know, people look up at me. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're so cool. You're this blah, blah, blah black belt rank. I suck at being this rank because I'm new to being this rank. I'm a really good white belt. You want me to do anything that's required by a white belt? I can do it better than any white belt can do it, right? That's the joke. That's the point. But like, the further along I am, I'm still learning new things, and I'm trying to get better at it. And this assumption that there's this dichotomy of learners, like we have the expert master's degree learners, and we have these novice, you know, elementary learners. You know, those elementary students are going to be the best elementary students by the time they get to middle school. That's the point. That's how this system's designed, is that as we go further along our education journey, we are smarter, better, quicker, more efficient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope, folks, you can take away a little bit from my own humility today of like, no, it's okay to be a 20 plus year practitioner who sucks at something, because it's something new that I'm trying to learn. And I'm going back through those feelings of being a white belt 20 plus years later. That's it's fun. I love it. It's motivating for me. Some people that's not as motivating, but that's it. That's kind of a principled approach here with our learners. Like, come to your 8-year-olds and make them the best 8-year-old learners they can be. That's the goal. I'm not trying to make them a master's degree student. We don't have to worry about whether or not they can apply the same concepts at the same level. The quality will be different, but let's not hold them back and say they can't learn it at all. They'll learn anything they're motivated and present to learn.
I think the point is asking what should they be able to apply at this point. It's not about can they apply. It's about what could they apply at this point. I remember hearing conversations with people in my field about being like, well, they can't interpret this until they get this. It's like, well, no, I mean, they can do it poorly, but they can try to apply it. Like, it's, like, what's the damage? What is going to be the problem if we put them in from the deep end in the beginning? Obviously not unmotivating them and making them feel horrible and like in all those dynamics, like putting them in a place where they're not ready, but putting them in a place where they have to think critically and apply some things, even in a 100 level course to a 500 level course. The application could be there. This ironically, this episode ended up basically becoming Will and I going apply at all levels. Like, that's basically our concept here. There's a lot of other things that could probably be put across those different areas, but I think that's probably the safe area that Will and I feel like going. One could argue that it's kind of like a journey, Will. Learning is a journey, if you will. It's at all stages of the journey you can apply and do things. It just looks different.
Especially when you're in the middle of the journey.
Yeah, when you're in the middle of the journey,
in the middle of your journey,
you can really hit that. So as you might have picked up, we're trying to transition. It's been a while, but it's guess what? We haven't gotten any better at it. We're still cheesy. We're still there. Today, we can talk about this a lot more, and I'm sure we'll come back to this topic. I feel like there's some stuff we can dive into on the High Tech Podcast with this topic, but we're going to journey to our app a bit here today.
Allow me to set you up, my friend. Put the ball on the pedestal, because I have nothing to say other than Josh is really good at this. So I'm just going to step back.
I am the yellow belt who's a good white belt right now. That's basically what I am.
Well done, my friend. Like when we did an episode about Notion or Canva, and I just tossed it over to Josh. We're talking about Midjourney this episode. We actually have already talked about Midjourney on a previous episode that hopefully Josh is going to start looking up in a second while I continue.
It's the opening AI series, if you will. That it is a certain episode number that I'm going to start looking up.
When we launched that episode and the opening AI series, we were familiar with Midjourney. We had tested it out. There's a free trial version, but we hadn't yet had a practical application to get our hands on it and start to use it for. We were only at the college recovery stage. Call back. So now Josh has spent probably cumulatively 10, 15, 20 hours in this thing.
More hours than I should have at this point. Yeah, to the point that it's getting angry at me at how many hours I've spent in it. It's
get out.
It's not happy about it. In case you were curious, we talked about Midjourney episode 107.
107. Go ahead back and listen to that first take on Midjourney and 107. But now I'm just going to get out of the way. We're back to it because Josh has started to use it more, and Josh has learned a lot more about how you can take advantage of this tool. So, Josh, why are we doing Midjourney again? Why is this so useful?
So if you're looking for the what is Midjourney, you should definitely go to episode 107, because we talk a bit more about what it is in that episode, and probably a counterpart that a lot of people are familiar with, Adobe Firefly, in that episode. Yep. And if you want to get the whole picture of AI, that is from the opening AI series. So if you haven't listened to that yet, that's episodes 105 through 109. We talk about AI across the spectrum, but we're constantly still learning. And so Midjourney is something that we have started using. I have been able to have the fun of being the person on Will and I's team that is using it while he's knocking it out of the park with other things. But what we found interesting, if you use Midjourney, and the reason we wanted to talk about it a little bit more is that Midjourney at its core, we talked about it in episode 107, it's a image generation tool. But what's interesting about Midjourney is at the time, we didn't know at what level you could adapt Midjourney to meet what you needed. And since then, I've been learning things you can do in it. So, like for context, in Midjourney, you create a prompt, right? You put it in. Midjourney is not necessarily the non-techie friendly version of these AI image tools, because you have to install it into a tool called Discord that Will and I use all the time. But we will give you some tutorials on how to do that. And in fact, episode 107, I showed you how to do that. So you can go back to episode 107 and do that. But on the episode page. But what's interesting about it is you drop in a prompt, right? So you tell it what you want. You can be like, I want a nature scene with a pig floating in it. I don't know why you would want that. It seems like a weird thing that you would like to do, but okay. I just said whatever came to my mind at that point. I don't know why.
It's fair.
You can tell it want that. What's interesting about Midjourney is you can actually, in your prompt, then through some settings, tell it like what style you want that to be. You can tell it what ratio size you want the image to be. What Will and I have been learning is that you can actually go in and tell it like, I want that, but I want that in like an illustrated version of it. Like I want it kind of look like it's drawn, right? And so you can go in and adapt it that way. And you can even use tags in Midjourney. So there's a style tag system that you can use where you can tell it from like a number from 0 to like 1,000. And at different sections of that rating, it changes kind of the fidelity of the image, right? So I can go in and tell it I want it at 0 and it'll give me kind of a really basic illustrated image. But if I go in and put it at like 500 style, it'll give me a much more detailed image, right? And so it'll give me a little bit more. So what's interesting about this tool is that it just gives you a lot of flexibility to create things, to imagine things, and make it a reality. And so what I think is helpful about education is that Midjourney becomes a powerful tool for asset generation. Now that looks different in different places, right? So if you're just a teacher and you're teaching a class, that probably means it would be very powerful for stuff to put in to your presentations and do your videos that you're doing for students. Like let's say you want you want to create something and you want to create kind of like a background for something, right? Or an image that you want to put in, or you want Ian McKellen but who looks like Sherlock Holmes because you're talking about Sherlock Holmes. You can make that happen, right? You can put that into Midjourney and it can give you that image that doesn't really exist and it can give it to you in an interesting style. I've seen people doing this. There was somebody creating Ian McKellen as different characters while I was in Midjourney. And it was working. Like it was legitimately Ian McKellen like dressed up like different characters. It was really weird. But what's also cool is you can then like combine images. You can meld them together to kind of create a new image. You can set a style for it with it. So like what's interesting, those of you listening to this podcast who might be doing more like course design or e-learning development in those areas, what Will and I have been discovering is with Midjourney, you can create characters and things and actually use the stuff that you create to then kind of set a baseline for what you're creating in Midjourney, to create more versions of that character. Now, it's not perfect. What's interesting with Midjourney and AI tools like that is that AI gets weird sometimes. As Will and I have discovered, we've generated something that had Biggie in the background, even though I didn't tell Biggie to be there. It's not perfect. But with other tools and kind of a combination, you can kind of build yourself a system of being able to get stuff that you would have had to pay for packs and things in the past. That is very interesting. So like from a course design standpoint, if you're looking to create like an experience, right, in your course, in the past, it would have been a lot of work to create environments and create characters and kind of create an experience for students, right? That would have been a ton of work in the past. With Midjourney, it's still work. Like I'm not gonna pretend that like what Will and I have been discovering, I just put in a prompt in Midjourney and the magic thing comes out, right? That is not the case. We've gotten weird stuff, very weird things, and like so it doesn't always work that way. But with a little tweaking and a little work, you can get that stuff, right? And so like I've been able to generate backgrounds for a thing that Will and I are working on. We've been able to generate characters out of this, things that in the past Will and I couldn't have done ourselves. We would have either had to get packs or have somebody else help us with, or it would have taken significantly more time than it is taking currently. So what's cool is that with just a little bit of learning, you can kind of pull that in. So what I am going to do for those of you listening, if you're curious, on our episode page for this episode, I am going to drop in our episode 107, I showed you some examples, right? So if you're curious about some examples, we'll link back to that and you can go check it out. I think I did two penguins fighting as
That's
Jedi
right.
with lightsabers on a cliff in front of Rome. That totally happened. And my wife may have influenced some of the things we got, like a kitten holding a putter playing golf at a carnival. That was
Perfect.
one of the images. So I'll show you that stuff. But what I'll do in this episode is we're going to drop in examples of prompts that Will and I have actually written for Midjourney. And so what we'll do there is show you kind of how I format the prompts and how that impacts what you get, right? Because some of these tricks I've learned, I've found just from people on Twitter, or I've Googled things, and I've looked up how people are doing stuff on Midjourney. I've been influenced by people who were doing other prompts in the tool that I could see while I was doing mine. And I've been like, oh, that was a good way to word that. I'm totally stealing that from your prompt, and we're going to make sure I do that.
You're all prompt engineering.
Exactly. The thing that I also really like about Midjourney that I think is different than some of the other tools, Midjourney has a feature that allows you to drop an image in and have Midjourney describe it to you. This is a really cool trick if you're using AI tools like this. One of the difficulties with AI tools is trying to figure out how to communicate what you want to the AI, right? AI is not human. So like, for instance, a good example of this would be Will and I are generating a thing. We want 6 doors, okay, in there. And I tell it to give me 6 doors in this room, right? What I get is a passive-aggressive AI handing me like 2 doorways with 3 doors in it, or like one that had a door on the roof. Like it was like a weird thing. Like it was really strange.
Folks, I saw like the second take. I saw like the beta after that, and I was like, this is still like a little janky. Like it just was fighting him so much.
Yeah, it was not great. But what I did is Will had given me an image that was like not what we wanted, but was like, this is the same type of thing. So I got the idea of putting it into Midjourney, having Midjourney describe that image back to me, and seeing how Midjourney described the image. And what that helped me do is find ways the AI described that image and then pull that out of what it's described and put it into my prompt to get the AI to get me what I wanted. So what I like about Midjourney is they've got tools to help you do stuff like that. Like if you find an image on Google, you're like, I want something like this. You can get that image, put it into Midjourney, and have it describe it back to you and leverage some of that. It's not a perfect science. Some of AI feels like I'm just basically talking to a very confused artist who's also on drugs, which, you know, whatever.
Not too far from the truth.
It's not too far from the truth. So anyway, you can check that out. There's definitely different ways to do it, to play around with it, to do what you're doing. And you'll have fun doing it. It's a good time. You get some interesting stuff out of the process as well. But it's just, I think what's so powerful about these image creation tools specifically is it's empowering those of us like Will and I who are not in a place where we can create a bunch of content visually, but we don't need like movie level artistic content. Like we need something that an average person could just draw or make up or come up with, and we need it to just kind of work like that. That is really helpful, and I think that could help educators or those designing content or building learning experiences to maybe bridge a gap that in the past they felt was unreachable to them. I feel like that's what I've really learned as we've been leveraging Midjourney and playing around with it.
My only contribution to this conversation, besides huzzah, is to check out on LinkedIn not only us, the High Tech Podcast, Josh and myself specifically, because we post some tutorials, we post some work about how we're doing this, or, you know, like follow us. We love that. But go follow Tom Kuhlman at Articulate. He's the chief learning architect at Articulate. Tom works on, I hope it's him, I assume it's him, but maybe he's got a team helping him. He posts free character packs to his LinkedIn profile that were generated with AI generation. And they're free to use, and he's, you know, all the security and licensing and whatever. Now, a ton of people are following him and probably using them, and now they're going to be all flooded in e-learning modules, right? So you may not want to use it, but here's why I say he's posting that kind of content. He's helping, like, this was some of the stuff that drove us to try it.
Oh yeah,
Finding
he was a
someone
big
like him who's
influence.
putting that content out there. And so you could A, use the character packs if you're interested, B, see the kind of content he's posting, C, he's the chief learning architect at Articulate, and that's a pretty good person to have in your network because he's posting really good content. And A, B, C, D, E. Use his inspiration to go and try it yourself. Like, again, you may not have an idea of like what does a character look like? What should a good character like? His characters are really well refined. There's good poses. There's good diversity. It's just good. So that's Tom Kuhlman. LinkedIn.com/in/Tom TOM KUHLMANN. That'll be in the show notes, whatever links, whatever. But like,
we'll
go
also
look
put
for
that
Tom
on the episode
Kuhlman.
page. We haven't actually, he's in our network of LinkedIn, but we haven't asked him to do this. So it'll be interesting to figure out how we would have placed that in there. I will say he shares tutorials on how to do this too. That was actually how Will and I got into this.
Yep.
Is that he had shared a tutorial through Rise 360 Articulate tutorial on how to do it, and that was actually how I learned how to do it and get some of it. Now mine are still not as refined as his, mainly because the style we were going for was very different than his, so it became a different thing. But it's been a cool tool. If you're looking for something kind of combined with Midjourney that you can leverage, we haven't talked about this yet on the podcast, but we will share more about that tool in a future episode. You can go check out Figma. It's another tool that allows you to take what you get out of Midjourney and do more with it. And so that is a tool Will and I have been leveraging, and it's free for education. So ironically, actually, we have not put this on our list yet, and we keep saying we're going to, and we forgot to. So Will's putting that on right now. I can see that he's doing that. We will talk about Figma on the podcast more in the future, but
as soon as we possibly can.
As soon as we possibly can, because it is a very helpful tool for a ton of different people, but especially for those of us in education. Highly recommend checking it out if you're not already doing it. So for sure.
Yeah. All right. This is a wonderful long episode that Josh and I literally started by committing to each other would be a short episode. That's fine. We don't mind. But that's just worthwhile. Check it out. Midjourney. Check it out. Universal learning and why we think humans are humans and we can reach them with the tools and techniques we already have, regardless of context, regardless of age, et cetera, et cetera. We appreciate you coming along as always. Next episode 121, we're going to have Jonathan Lebov with us from Antimatter. Very excited. Antimatter is a meme generating platform and ecosystem. What we learned, right? I knew it could generate memes, and for education, that's what we knew beforehand. But we learned in the podcast, in the interview, that he's making activities, he's making learning, he's making not just memes. There's a whole intentionality, a whole structure to what they're doing. Tune in next week for that interview. It's going to be awesome. Find us as always on Twitter and YouTube at High Tech Podcast. Email us in the inbox, to our inbox. Send things
somewhere. Find the box that is in a place.
Inbox.
Yeah.
At inbox@hightechpod.us, which reminds us, of course, of our website, hightechpod.us, where the episode pages for every single episode are, including episode 107, which was our original episode on Midjourney, and any content for today's episode 120 on Midjourney, making sure we got as much as you possibly can to get started yourselves, right? That's why we have the website. We want to make sure that the information is out there on our apps, on our episodes, is useful to you and can get you and others started. Please do share those pages with your colleagues. Thank you again for joining us for another week of the High Tech Podcast as we continue to learn what it looks like to harness technology in the classroom, whether it's online, in person, or in the middle of some journey somewhere. See ya.
See ya.